this morning. For anyone who read Playbook, our star guest is not the Chancellor, it is the future Chancellor, Mel Stride.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start by asking Mel, I mean, during the spring statement, the OBR, which David Miles chaired, said that there were sort of three horsemen of the apocalypse. There were three sort of big risks to Rachel Reeves' plans. And I should have said, our guests today are Mel Stride, David Miles of the OBR, and Alys Denby of City AM. And I apologise, I have children, and
don't apologise for having children.
So there were three things which could knock the forecast, of course: productivity, interest rates, and bond markets, and Donald Trump. And sure enough, within days, Donald Trump has knocked the forecast. So is this the sort of the quickest that a spring statement or budget has become almost completely irrelevant? And also, in your position as Shadow Chancellor, what's your take on the impact tariffs are going to do? What do you think the government should be doing?
Okay, so there's a lot there.
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. So I think there are these three horses. So you've got tariffs which, depending on whether they're applied wholesale across all economies, including ours, whether we get an exemption, whether we retaliate or not, will have different levels of impact on our economy. And I think the OBR, David, suggests a peak impact if we do reciprocate of 1% or about 0.75% at the end of the forecast. Well, that will be enough to take away the entirety of Rachel Reeves' current headroom on the current budget. Productivity, I think, is just as, if not more worrying, actually, because if you look at the OBR's forecasts on productivity, most people say, despite the fact that they've sort of revised them down a bit based on some recent ONS data suggesting there were 500,000 people more in the workforce producing the same output as they had imagined previously. A sort of interesting reflection on the ONS and the accuracy of what they're doing at the moment, I think. They have nonetheless, the OBR, assumed, I think, a fairly positive, optimistic trend for productivity. Now, if that doesn't come to be, and we carry on at the same kind of productivity rate that we've had more recently, the implications at the end of the forecast are really catastrophic. I mean, it's going from a positive 10 billion on the so-called stability target down to possibly even 40 or 50 billion below water. So that is certainly an important metric to look at. The gilt movement, certainly if we saw gilts up on average across the forecast by 0.6%, that would see all of the headroom, the 10 billion, disappear. I would add one horse to the four horses, which is the possibility of a requirement in the medium term, at least, for further defence spending contingent upon what may or may not happen between Russia and Ukraine and European defence discussions and so on. But I think, just very quickly, if I may, because I know I'll take up a lot of time, I think those are all things which largely we have no control over. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the government is responsible for what Donald Trump may or may not decide to do. It will be in part because a free trade deal with the States, which is partly under our control, or that's something we can push for, is sitting in the lap of the government. But make no mistake, we have ended up with a very fragile economy due to the choices that this government has made. So if you go back to the election, the talk was all growth, growth, growth. Rachel Reeves came into office in that autumn budget last year. She ramped up taxes in a way that she said she never would do on employers, talked down the economy, the £22 billion black hole that was confected as a smokescreen to cover for the fact that they reneged on their fiscal promises, and incidentally that the OBR looked into and said they would not legitimise, at least not at the £22 billion level. And then a big fiscal loosening, which of course drove inflationary pressures, has meant inflation being a bit higher than would otherwise have been the case, with interest rates higher for longer, which had implications not just for mortgage holders and businesses, but critically, given the size of the debt that we're carrying at the moment, the debt servicing costs, which in fact, if you look at the destruction of the headroom that the Chancellor had from the autumn, has largely occurred because interest rates have fed through to higher debt servicing costs. So I suppose the picture I would paint is, yes, all sorts of big dangers out there to headroom, etc., but an economy that's been put in the wrong position to best withstand that.
Thank you. David, in the OBR's report, you do acknowledge that the OBR's economic forecasts are more optimistic than the consensus than the Bank of England's and the consensus of the market forecasters. I mean, given the Trump issues, are you feeling that you were too optimistic even just a few days ago?
Well, I mean, goodness knows where the Trump thing will go and tariffs, and there may be announcements this afternoon, and maybe by Friday they'll be different, and maybe by Monday they'll be different again. What we did do on the tariffs, incidentally, is put in some estimates of what might happen, not on a central forecast, but what might happen if various levels of tariff were imposed on the UK, and I can talk about that if people are interested in a bit. On the optimism thing, I must admit I'm slightly puzzled by the claim that the OBR is always too optimistic, or was too optimistic this time. I mean, what we did was, first of all, assume that the very substantial downgrade in measured productivity, in the level of productivity in the UK, which arose because the Office for National Statistics decided there were 500,000 more people working in the UK, but they hadn't produced a whole lot more output. So arithmetically, the estimate of the level of productivity is substantially lower, about 1.5% by the end of last year. And we didn't assume that we got that back. So we have a sort of projection for the growth of productivity, which is also a little bit weaker than we thought in October. And so by the end of the forecast horizon 5 years down the road, the level of productivity is pretty much a full 1.3, 1.4% lower than we thought back in October. So is that optimistic? I didn't seem to be particularly optimistic. Now, some people say, well, you assume that the level of growth of productivity is a bit higher than it has been over the last 10 years or so. And that's true. Because the last 10 years, I mean, it begins with the aftermath of the financial crisis, and then you've got COVID, and then a less powerful but nonetheless pretty negative hit from huge increases in energy prices after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you're asking the question, what does the next 5 or 10 years look like? You could just say, well, it'll look like the last 5 or 10 years. But I think that's probably not a central forecast. I think things are likely to be a bit better than that as a central prediction. Plenty of things could happen, could be a lot worse, could be better. So what we do at the OBR, with no great science behind it, is just say, supposing the next 5 years in the UK has a growth of productivity that's halfway between the absolutely dismal last 10 to 15 years and the much more strong productivity growth in the 50 years before that, which goes back to the Second World War. Now, some people say, well, that's ridiculously optimistic. Well, we won't know. We won't know until we're 10 years into the future, which might well not be alive. But so I hear a lot of media stuff about the OBR is ridiculously optimistic about this. I don't quite buy into it. I guess I wouldn't, because I spend most of my time thinking about those kind of issues at the OBR nowadays. Can I read you something from a bit of media coverage?
Of course.
It's very brief.
Of course.
It's from a newspaper that I'm sure many people here read avidly. It's the Socialist Worker.
Must renew my subscription. Sorry, you've reminded me.
Just who runs the Office for Budget Responsibility? The so-called financial watchdog whose predictions can make or ruin a government. It was the OBR last week that insisted that Chancellor Reeves' disability cuts didn't go far enough and that still more lives must be sacrificed. Reeves, of course, complied. Powerful but unelected OBR, far from neutral and independent, chaired by Richard Hughes, neoliberal economist, worked for the International Monetary Fund. Hughes sits on the all-powerful 3-person Budget Responsibility Committee with David Miles. Miles was a top economist at banker Morgan Stanley during the great financial crash, during which his bank faced potential collapse. It lost over 80% of its market value. We're not doing the OBR's work of enforcing neoliberalism on governments in Britain. Miles is also doing the same in Ireland, where he helps run the central bank. This bloke's out of control. It's news to me. Anyway, I thought that was the most insightful coverage
So what you're saying is a sort of a version of Dominic Cummings that everyone imagines there is a secret room full of ninjas, and there are no ninjas. There is no room. There is no all-powerful cabal of you and Richard sitting there.
I haven't noticed
shaping.
it. If it is, I don't know where it is, but there you go.
And Alys, I mean, obviously City AM is sort of quite plugged into the business sector and to City of London. I mean, what's the reaction been to the spring statement?
Yeah, well, first I'm glad you weren't reading from City AM there, because we did have an op-ed the other day saying the OBR should be abolished. I apologise, so I didn't write it.
I don't blame you.
No, I think the big picture from the City is one of uncertainty. So, across the market as a whole, Goldman Sachs, I think, has downgraded its growth forecast for the UK by just sort of 0.1 percentage point. So they're fairly optimistic, but if you look into individual sectors, they're very worried, they're very blindsided, they say. They don't know how to respond, particularly like pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, those sectors which have very complex interconnected supply chains. I think are just waiting to see what Trump says and don't know what to do.
But I think the consensus in this, aside from the tariff stuff, the consensus in the City, I think, is that the OBR put it at 50-50 that Reeves would meet her fiscal framework. I mean, I think most people would take the zero off the end of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think the consensus, as far as the spring statement goes, is that she is going to have to come back for more tax cuts in the autumn. 100% every business thinks that's going to happen.
Tax rises.
Tax rises. Sorry, yes. Spending cuts. Tax rises.
So a couple of sort of things to drill down on both from this spring statement, but sort of more broadly. Obviously, sort of both of which the OBR sort of hasn't quite been able to sort of fully quantify. But I mean, it was for me personally, it was very good news that the government has admitted that yes, building houses is essentially free growth, which is nice. I mean, Mel, obviously with your previous hat on as welfare and pension secretary, there were the welfare reforms and whether they go far enough, and then obviously the employment rights bill, which no one knows the effects of yet, not least because personal rant. The regulatory policy committee says that the estimates of its impact were utterly bollocks, and the government should go back and start them again. And despite Keir Starmer's commitment to reducing the cost of regulation on business, he hasn't. So what do you? So I mean, just to kind of provide a menu of things that you could talk about. I mean, obviously, housing and planning is a good structural reform. Inactivity is a huge issue. Business and employment. Like, which of those do you think is going to move the needle most? Which are you encouraged and worried about?
So on the points you've raised, I think what is interesting about the latest economic and fiscal outlook from the OBR is that there has been a scoring now for planning reform further on down the line. I think 0.2% GDP at the end of the forecast and a bit more 10 years hence. And I welcome that, actually, because one of the frustrations I had as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions was you'd often go to the OBR with some kind of intervention, often a new and radically different intervention because the old ones weren't working, and they would say, well, show me the proof that this works. Well, we can't show you that because we're doing things differently. Oh, well, then you're not going to get any scoring. So I think some more sort of thought and creativity around scoring would be to be welcomed. On the employment rights bill, where I think the government's own impact assessment suggested costs of up to $5 billion for businesses, the OBR have not baked in anything in respect of that into their forecasts. And I think the reason they would argue they haven't done that is that they know quite a lot about what the planning reforms are, and they know rather less about a piece of legislation that is currently going through Parliament with about 100 amendments to it. I would argue that you know enough about what's going to happen with the government with this kind of majority that you should probably have looked at scoring something in terms of the impact of that. On welfare, I find myself very sympathetic towards David and what he's just read out from the Socialist Workers' Party, because look, at the end of the day, the OBR is there to mark the Chancellor's homework, to tell us through its forecasts whether the Chancellor's fiscal targets will or will not be met and what the likelihood is of them being met. It is not there to conjure up economic policy, and it's not there to tell the Chancellor to do anything in particular. The fact, to get to welfare, that the government ended up in a position of having not only blown all its headroom from the autumn, but £4 billion in excess of that, and having to scrabble around at the last minute to fill the hole, was what drove this scrabbling about to find welfare savings and meet their own self-imposed fiscal targets. And what that led them to do, in my view, is to not pursue what I would call principled welfare reform. And by that I mean something that is fair to the taxpayer, because we have to get those spiralling welfare costs down, and they are forecast to go ever skyward. Okay, we have to do that. That is a fiscal necessity. But equally to do it in a way that is fair, in particularly to some very vulnerable people. And the way you do that is you think deeply about it. We had various welfare reforms when we were in office that saved a lot of money and would have seen, according to the OBR, about 450,000 fewer people going on to long-term sickness and disability benefits, for example. But we did it in that measured way that was hit those two particular metrics. So my concern here is that we've ended up with kind of the worst of both worlds. We've had a government that's pulled the easy levers on welfare, which is to do with changing gateways into benefits and particularly freezing and cutting the level of benefits, which will not save as much money, anything like as much money as fundamental, properly thought through reform. PIP would be an example of that, totally overhauling that benefit rather than tweaking it about, and also seeing a lot of people that are going to be caught up in hard edges from this policy. So I found all that scurrying around at the last minute to try and squeeze exactly the right amount of money out of the system.
To two decimal places.
Yeah, it was to £2 million, I think that's right. So I think the headroom was 9.9 billion back in autumn of 24. Yeah. It came in within £2 million of that, and there was a final round of fine-tuning that finally squeezed that almost to the million. That is not what should drive welfare reform. It should be the things that I've described. And I'd be very interested, actually, David, any observations you have, because I know you mention it in the EFO, as to this sort of late-stage iteration that was going on around welfare and the challenges you had as a consequence. But, yeah, that would be my thoughts.
Before, can I just push on to the...
Yeah.
Do you know why you had this welfare reform on the runway, which would have saved them more money.
Yeah.
You spent quite a, a long time considering it. It was blocked by judicial review because of the consultation process rather than the policy itself.
Correct.
Why didn't they just say, here's this thing, it's sitting there in a microwave, let's just take it out?
The government, you mean? I have no idea. They should have kept it. They should have just basically said, look, we'll rerun the consultation and you can keep the scoring. It was £5 billion worth of savings across the scorecard. The net effect of that and what they've actually done is that the OBR is now scoring more people stuck on incapacity benefits with no requirement to look for work and a smaller employment impact as a consequence of the changes they brought in and scrapping ours. I mean, it's mad. I can only imagine it's a kind of ideological thing. They thought, well, the Tories did that, we'll get rid of that. But I think it was wrong.
And then, David, sorry, just...
Well, I want to agree with something Mel said there, which is that the reason why we score some things and not score other things quite often is because some policies have enough detail and you kind of know what the policy is, so that we can, at the OBR, assess what the economic implications might be. And sometimes policy just isn't quite there yet, and sometimes policy doesn't get there. So that was really the difference between planning reform on housing, where there was now a lot of detail about what they were going to do, about allowing building residential development on bits of the green belt, called now grey belt. That was all at least pretty clear what was going to happen. So we were able to have quite good conversations at the OBR with house builders about what did they think the effects of that were. On the employment rights legislation...
But just to say on that, you only scored the national planning policy framework, which was the thing they did straight away, not the planning and infrastructure bill, which is currently going through.
Because there was much more detail on what was going to happen of the changes to planning as it affected residential housing, and less detail now, yet anyway, on the infrastructure stuff. Exactly. And that's why, as Mel said, really, rightly, we did not come up with any kind of assessment at this event about the impact of employment rights legislation, which is going through, but there are lots of amendments. It's pretty unclear still on some of the big issues where that will end up. When it does become clear, at that point, we'll take a look at it and try and work out what effects it might have on the economy and on employment. On the welfare stuff, it might be helpful for people to understand a little bit about how the OBR works on these things. So the government will have some policy in some area, there'll be a particular department, you know, it could be the DWP, or on planning reform, it was the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I forget what that's called. MHCLG.
Yeah.
Thank you. So there'll generally be a department that takes the lead on analysis of some policy development that the government has, and the OBR will rely on that department to a large extent, where there's a lot of expertise on the issue, to come up with their assessment of the effects. But all the OBR really is to look at that assessment and say, does this make sense? We'll do our own adjustments to it, and that's how we'll end up either so-called scoring or not scoring a particular measure. So on the welfare stuff, the lead department is the Department of Work and Pensions. That iterative process of a department coming up with its assessment of what the impacts of some policy are, talk to the OBR, we raise some questions with them, they go back and do some more analysis, we then talk to other people, do our independent analysis. That plays out over a period of several weeks leading up to a budget or a spring statement. In this case, on the welfare stuff, there were changes being made relatively late in the day, and we weren't able to feel confident enough in analysing the employment effects of what was being proposed on welfare. So we ended up saying there are some things we can see the likely cost or reductions in spending, but on the rather big issue of what it would do, what the welfare reforms might do to employment, we weren't yet in a position, neither was the DWP, to have got a sort of firm evidence base for that, and so we'll have to be doing that at the next fiscal event in the autumn.
Because it was sort of reported as the OBR throwing the government's costings back in its face and prompting a treasury meltdown and scramble for cash. But
yeah, that's a bit overdramatic.
Your colleague Richard Hughes made some rather pointed references to agreed dates and deadlines in his press conference afterwards, suggesting that yes, if they'd sent us the policies on time, then we wouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I mean, it's pretty complex. Well, Mel will know this. This is a pretty complex area. You're trying to work out what the impacts over several years of changes in the welfare system, particularly related to, you know, health benefits, and assess what the impact that might be down the road on how many people are on benefits, how many people are working who would otherwise not be working. That's not something you can do in, you know, on the back of a piece of paper or with a spreadsheet in, you know, 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon.
But how unusual, though, David, would it be for a department with a major set of welfare reforms to come to you late in the day without even themselves having an argument or an assessment of the employment impact of those measures?
Well, as I say, I think it's pretty. This is a complicated set of changes.
You can be honest in your answer.
You know better than anyone. This is a complicated set of changes, and you know things were moving around. Tweaks to the measures, you know, quite late in the day, so it's not easy to come up with an assessment. I mean, an assessment will be made, so it's not like we'll never know. I mean, we will know.
I suppose what I'd say is that obviously in government you do things by department. Your job is to assess the impact of individual policies, but that's not how the real economy works. So these things are all interconnected, and obviously business groups are warning that the impact of NICS rises and the Employment Rights Bill will be
and minimum wage.
Yeah, will result in eye-watering job losses, which obviously has a further impact on welfare and on planning reform and house building. The construction industry said it just doesn't have the workers to build 1.3 million houses. So these things all relate.
Oh, well, sure, we know that. I mean, that's why it takes us a long time to work out the effects of the policies. You're right, and we did the NICS thing back in the October budget when we had we knew what the measure was.
I'll throw it open to questions in a bit, but I just wanted to ask one sort of bigger picture question. So, with all due respect to the conversation we've been having and the work of the OBR and the spring statement, fundamentally, the whole of Westminster spent 2 weeks obsessing about, as Richard Hughes, to be fair, has pointed out, obsessing about £14 billion of leeway on what is predicted to be £1.4 trillion of spending, based on forecasts that even if the OBR had a team like could borrow a supercomputer from NASA and could get every economics PhD student in the country working for them, you're talking about figures 5 years out, which there's a wonderful sort of chart of public spending as a percentage of GDP, and it sort of goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and then according to the OBR it just kind of stays pretty much flat, but in a way that it absolutely never has done, because the world changes. So if you kind of widen your gaze to say, look at the macro condition perspective, are we not in an absolutely diabolical position? All of the sort of big charts, all of the things like debt, tax, spending, economic inactivity, they are all in the wrong place, and productivity are in the wrong place or going in the wrong direction. I mean, we are pinning our hopes on the idea that somehow the civil service can get more efficient. Somehow, effectively, it's almost that something will turn up, and it hasn't turned up yet, and it's hard to see it turn up. And beyond all of this, as the OBR has said in other publications, there is just the sheer tidal force of demographics, the fact that we are an ageing population which needs more and more expensive healthcare, and the share of the GDP taken up by the NHS is going to double over the next half century. Is there any hope for what hope for the country's long-term finances?
In a sentence, the Conservative Party in opposition, because what you have raised is a question that basically says, how do we at least get back to David's point about the trend growth and productivity we had before the great financial crisis, before about 2008.
Before the Conservatives came into power.
That was actually before we came into power. Yeah, that's true. Although Labour were in power after 2008. But anyway, nonetheless, if we had just continued on at the same rate of productivity improvements, growth generally, the economy would be 25% bigger today. Okay, if we had the same productivity as France or Germany or the United States, it would probably be between about 15 and 20% bigger than it is today. And the answer to your question is somehow we have to get back into that place rather than where we are at the moment. So the question then becomes, well, what drives that transformation, that rewiring of the economy? And that is a very deep question with many, many strands, but let me quickly touch on some of them. One is the way the tax system works. So first of all, the overall tax burden, which we know is already at a post-war kind of high, also the highest for many decades, and is now forecast to go to the highest level in our history. We have to get that down. We know there's a correlation between lower tax and higher growth in economies. We need to look at the tax system at every single level and ask the question, are these taxes leaning into growth, or are they complicating a tax base which is having implications that are slowing activity and growth down? So some on the right say there are a whole bunch of LAFA taxes, we can just slash them left, right and centre and get more yield. I personally don't believe that, but there are certainly some like stamp duty, land tax, a transaction-based tax on property, for example, where I think you probably could drop it and get more revenue because you get more transactions. Shares could be another 0.5% on shares. There are anomalies within the way the income tax system works, the withdrawal of the personal allowance over 100,000, all sorts of things that stop people doing things that are economically active. Then you've got regulation and arm's length bodies and the remits that things like the FCA and the Prudential Regulatory Authority and others have. How much are they leaning into growth? What is their appetite for risk rather than burdening businesses with red tape in an attempt to protect both the system and consumers? I think there needs to be a discussion around that. The size of the state. We had 365,000 civil servants before the pandemic. We've now got 515,000. That tells you a lot, okay, and that needs to be reversed. Education and skills, talk about building homes and whether they've got enough people on the construction side. Well, if we're going to choke off net migration, which is supplying quite a lot of that kind of labour, we are going to have to look hard at higher education, which is too often producing results that for the individuals that receive that higher education doesn't justify the expense of having achieved it. And look at apprenticeships and the whole skills space. Welfare, we've already talked about. We're going to have to dramatically reduce the cost of welfare. And then a whole bunch of supply side things, which are things like building homes and planning, where this government is saying a lot of things, and the OBR is beginning to score them. But roads, rail. The reason why we don't have more development around Cambridge, which is an obvious place for some super value-added businesses, is because there's not enough water in the area. We haven't built a reservoir in this country for 30 years, okay? So we've got to get that stuff moving. How do we do it the way the Chinese do it, which they decide to do it and then they build the thing, rather than what we do, which is, what we do. And the final thing I would say is energy costs. So how do you have a highly growing productive economy if you're paying 4 times as much for your energy as the United States are? So there needs to be a deep, serious conversation about that. To your question about how, therefore, we address those things, those are the kind of things we look at. I think we will arrive as a party with an answer to those questions, but it will not take weeks or months. It will take a matter of a few years. It will be ready before the next general election. But it comes to another point that you haven't raised, is people criticise my party at the moment because we're not pulling policies like rabbits out of a hat, left, right and centre, right? A, it wouldn't work because people aren't actually quite ready to listen to us as a party yet, after what happened in the election and before. But secondly, the kind of thing we need to tell them about needs to be thoughtfully thought through if we're to solve the problems that the country faces.
David, I mean, obviously you can't go quite as party political as Mel did there, but what's your take on the? I mean, how screwed is the country in the long term?
When did you last beat your children? Yeah.
On a measure of 1 to 10, how screwed are we? Well, 4.73s. I mean, it amuses me sometimes to read. There's a lot of press about how the OBR is ridiculously optimistic. I mean, they should read the reports we put out over the long-term fiscal position, which, Robert, I think you know the kind of things we say there. And we put out a very gloomy report in the middle of the summer, hoping it doesn't depress people too much. We couldn't put it out when days are short. Spike in suicide. Which looks at a sort of 50-year horizon. Now, on the 50-year horizon, on current policies like spending as much as we do on the health service,
Triple lock
on pensions, given the demographics and all that, it's a pretty grim picture. I mean, it's not really a forecast. It's saying that if you didn't do anything about it, on current policies over several decades, the stock of debt to GDP would be exponentially rising, and getting towards 300% of GDP. That's not a forecast because that wouldn't happen. Because at some point, probably the bond market would say we're not going to just carry on buying more and more government debt when the trajectory for the debt to GDP ratio isn't just rising, it's rising exponentially. So that's a scale of kind of the challenge that has to be faced at some point over the next several decades to put the UK on a longer term sustainable fiscal trajectory. So I don't disagree with your depiction of the sort of scale of the problem. I mean, it's not for the OBR to say, well, what policies then are needed. I mean, our role is to respond to the government's policies and say, well, we think on balance this is the most likely outcome if that's what you're going to do. But I don't disagree with your depiction of a really challenging long-run fiscal position for the UK.
So you got your ticket to Dubai already?
Oh God! No, I suppose what I would say from City M's perspective, the thing that we're closest to in terms of doom and gloom is business sentiment, and it's absolutely in the tank. Businesses are very frustrated, and I think I think what's particularly affecting their confidence, aside from everything we've talked about, is the feeling that they have a government that doesn't respect them, that doesn't like them, that has no experience in business, and is it has vindictive policies that deliberately designed to drive wealth creators away on non-doms, on inheritance tax, and on private schools. They feel like the government hates them.
Okay. Questions? Well, lots of questions. Good. Should we start in this area, Vincent? Maybe the lady there and then the gentleman next to her.
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Artie. I work in tax for a fintech in the city, and I'm a Conservative candidate as well. I wanted to know, I think this question is particularly sort of for Mel. Everyone seems to think it's quite likely that the government's going to come back with higher taxes in the autumn, probably taxes on high earners and on wealth. I want to know, what's the chance that we're going to end up in a doom loop, so that there'll be more wealth creators fleeing the country and high earners? And as a party, as the Conservative Party, what are we going to do to oppose that?
Okay, I think that's a really great question. Because look, at the end of the day, we all feed ourselves, travel to work, do whatever we do because businesses create wealth. Okay, I mean, that's the source of the river. Okay, and we've kind of lost sight of that in different ways through time. What do I think the Chancellor is most likely to do if the headroom is under pressure in the autumn, which I think is highly likely? I think she probably will go for tax. The reason will be she could change her fiscal rules, and bear in mind she's already changed the ones she inherited, rules that actually gave her 23 billion of headroom against the current budget rule, and then she changed to something called public snuffle, I call it, okay, for the other rule. If she's stuck with the PSND rule, as we had, David, I think it's fair to say that she wouldn't be hitting that target at all. It would be going west entirely. What I think, sorry, to get back to your question, what I think she would most likely do is probably extend the freeze to the threshold for income tax, which I think raises about 10 billion or thereabouts. David will be able to tell us, but let's see. Your point, though, about tax and wealth creators is absolutely right. So under this government, for the reasons that Alison has identified, and tax changes, particularly on those that are wealthy, about 10,000 millionaires, I mean, that goes up to the billionaires in that group, that 10,000, have left the country, okay? The cost of that, to replace the tax they were paying, okay, on average, would require about 1/3 workers on average earnings to pay that tax. So that is the extent, purely in tax take terms, of that problem, and it's getting worse. So what would we do? I don't have the ready answer, because as I explained earlier, renewing where we are is going to take a lot of time. But central to achieving my mission as Shadow Chancellor will be to get to a tax system that means people are kicking the door down to get in here, right? Not running away to Dubai and Italy and Monaco and wherever else they're going. That has to be central to what we do.
I was told recently that Monaco has had to hire extra visa officials just to process all the...
yeah, probably.
Yeah, some wealth managers have a sort of concierge service in Milan to like sort out your school and your house. And
Yeah, well, Italy is getting a big inflow from here. Yeah.
I mean, David, presumably you can't really comment on what the Chancellor should do.
Well, I mean, our forecast is what it is. I mean, we think of it, and I hope it is, a central forecast, by which one means that there are risks either side of it. So, I mean, there's certainly, with a relatively small amount of headroom, given the size of the economy, there's a significant chance, of course, that things continue to go in the wrong direction, and that headroom may have gone by the autumn. I think there's as big a chance that things go in the other direction. I mean, we've already baked in the forecast that the OBR came out with last week, the recent, pretty dire news on productivity. There's been an increase in interest rates since last October. Energy prices went up just at the right time to affect the bills that people will now be getting for their energy bills, and that's why inflation is a bit higher now in the near term than we thought back in October. So we'd already baked all that, on the whole, pretty negative news between last October and now, March, and made a forecast on the basis of starting from that position. Now, of course, it could be that the next 6 months brings as much bad news as the last 6 months, and that just carries on. I don't think you'd call that a central forecast. That's a kind of Eeyore the donkey. Like, you can only ever get bad news. For what it's worth, and there's a bit of spurious accuracy in this calculation, we reckon that there was about slightly better than 50% chance, I think it's 54% chance, that's spurious accuracy, a bit better than 50% chance that as things would play out with the balance of good and bad shocks, just a bit above a 50% chance the government could be on the right side of its headroom going forward. But that is what it is. I mean, it says that there's a slightly bigger than 50% chance that actually things will get better, and there might be more headroom in October. So, it's not inevitable by any means, on the basis of our analysis anyway, that it's inevitable now that you need more spending cuts and tax rises. I wouldn't say that was right.
Most optimistic thing I've heard since because we've got quite a lot of questions. I'm not going to ask each of our panellists to respond to every question. So just bear with me. So the gentleman next, and then the lady in the front row.
Thanks. I'm John Moss from College Green Group. You were on Newsnight, I think, David, and the lady who was on with you, forgive me, I didn't catch her name, she said that Donald Trump's tariffs were tactics in support of his strategy. Do you think our government has a strategy, or is it just focusing on tactics?
Unless I'm dreaming, I don't think I was on Newsnight. But
I recognise the accent.
Oh, right.
Newsnight,
maybe I was. Having a senior moment, I can't remember. I was on Newsnight.
Or I am.
I mean, to be honest, I think the government's in a very difficult position. I mean, I don't know what it's how you would describe it. Is it tactics? Is it something else? I think part of the reason why all this is tricky, and the reason why, coming back to what we do at the OBR, which I feel most appropriate for me to comment on, what's difficult for the government and what was difficult for the OBR in thinking about tariffs was what on earth is the policy that the current US government will follow, to which the UK will need to respond. I mean, one simply doesn't know, and it seems to potentially change not just by the week, but by the hour. What one can do, and let me just briefly say what the OBR analysis was to say what would be the implications of very substantial tariffs on the UK, 20-25% pretty much on all goods, not services, on all goods. And what would happen if the UK and other countries retaliated in kind or didn't retaliate at all? And the impacts are pretty substantial if those kind of tariffs are imposed on the UK and kept in place for 5 years. Our central forecast was that it knocks something like between about 0.6 and 1% of GDP. That's a pretty chunky effect. Fiscally, would be bad news to the tune of 10 billion or maybe a little bit more. That's about the size of the headroom that exists. Of course, that in some ways that's a very pessimistic scenario, because that's saying that not only does the UK face 20-25% tariffs, but they're in place for 5 years, which of course is beyond the next US presidential election, if there is another presidential election. So that's a pretty dire scenario, and we showed what the implications.
But were you? I mean, hopefully, and forgive me because I didn't read this section in detail.
Yeah.
You said the retaliation would be more economically damaging than, like, if this becomes a mutual global thing, as opposed to something that we sort of grin and bear.
Yes, it was simply two scenarios. One in which you get these kind of tariffs on the UK and pretty much every other developed country, and there's no concerted retaliation. And then another scenario in which there was. The economic impact, the GDP impacts, were somewhat worse if every country retaliates. The fiscal implications were about the same, because you do at least, I'm not in favour of tariffs at all, but I mean, you do get the tariff revenue if there's concerted retaliation against the US. So that's why, although the GDP impacts were slightly worse if everybody retaliates against the US, the purely fiscal outcomes were about the same, because the extra tariff revenue you get offsets the fact that the GDP hit is bigger if everybody retaliates.
So I was just going to ask you a question, actually, David, because I think this is interesting. There is a possibility, of course, that we get a carve-out, which is another scenario. So there are tariffs applied across the world, and we're sitting there with nothing happening to us.
Yes.
That could actually, maybe, be net beneficial on the basis of we're then selling into markets with a higher tariff wall to our competitors, and we've got trade diversion of cheaper products now coming to our shores, concerns about dumping and all that kind of anti-competitive stuff, but nonetheless could be deflationary, could take the pressure off interest rates, could have all those sort of consequences. Was there any thinking done around that, and what are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I mean, I was at the Treasury Select Committee yesterday morning and said pretty much exactly that. There is
maybe that's what our questioner was watching instead of Newsnight.
There is a scenario that there's a mild positive for the UK. And it's exactly the one that you just described. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways this could play out.
But Alys, at the moment, pretty much everyone in the city is just freaking out.
Yeah, I don't think anybody believes we'll get a carve-out. I mean, we've been trying to get a trade deal with America for years. It hasn't happened. I think we know that the price would be agricultural goods, which would send the farmers, who are already having a bad time, up in arms. And yeah, I don't think there's a lot of faith that this can happen. A lot of hope, but not a lot of confidence, I would say.
And then we'll go to the...
Thank you. Erin Olsen from The Telegraph. I have a question for Mel Stride and then another one for David Miles. Mel, I was just hoping to ask you, what would you have done different if it was your spring statement? And for David, the minimum wage has risen again this week. It's gone up by nearly 40% in 4 years. Are we reaching a level where the rises are so fast compared to average wages that it's potentially, an obstruction to employment or full employment? And And then we've had quite a lot of people on the left in relation to the disability and sickness benefit cuts say, why doesn't the government just tax wealth instead? Now, I know the government does tax wealth in many different ways, but say if we come to autumn and Reeves is looking at some wealth taxes, where could she get the most sort of value for money, and what would be the least harmful or best options? Thank you.
Starting with Mel.
Okay, so your question about what would I have done differently, that's like saying to somebody, the car is going at 500 miles an hour, the wall is just there, here's the steering wheel, you know, now it's over to you. What clever thing are you going to pull off that avoids the impact? But that aside, let's think seriously about it. So if I was in Rachel Reeves's position and I had sufficient time prior to the what we call the emergency budget, we'll call spring statement for now, I would have looked at welfare and going further in the principled way I described, making further savings. I would have looked for those levers that could have had the most immediate impact on the animal spirits in the economy. And I would have looked for something that would have probably been an intersection of a tax move that might help business and B, something that was quite counterintuitive. For example, might it have been possible within that scenario to have actually rode back to some degree on the national insurance hike? Now, question to Alison, what would Alison be saying now? Sorry, Alice, I'm so sorry. I did know it was Alice, and I don't know why I said. So what would Alice be reporting back now if we were sitting here, just had a spring statement in which the next cut was substantially rode back on? Alice would probably be saying it's not enough, but do you know what? People out there are getting a bit interested. They think the direction of travel's changed, it's an inflection point, etc. So I would have been trying desperately, back to the car analogy, to at least, you know, put the brakes on to that degree. Going back a bit further, though, a very legitimate question that you didn't ask, and many people ask me, is, well, going back at the start, when the autumn the first budget back in the autumn of last year, what would you have done differently? It's all very well to criticise the spending here and all the rest of it, but what would you have done? Well, I would have done at least three things. One is I would have had very different choices around tax spend and borrowing. Okay, and I've described at the beginning of my opening remarks the sort of implications of what they've done in terms of dampening business and inflating the economy and higher interest rates and higher servicing costs of the national debt and all that kind of feed through to the headroom. I would have focused much more on productivity. So I would not have come in as Chancellor and given the train drivers 14%, junior doctors 22%, anybody else who wanted money and happened to have a strong trade union, without any strings attached, any requirement to improve productivity, particularly in the public sector where it's actually been negative since the pandemic, the health service being the prime example. And the third thing I would have done is I would have come in with much bigger reforms to welfare that would have saved substantially more money, and I would have used that to have eased the pressures in the more productive, you know, in areas like tax and so on.
And then, David, the question's to you on...
I'm so sorry.
To you on, it's fine. On minimum wage and wealth taxes. Or in future, one question per person, please. I know journalists love to...
Yeah, let me talk about the minimum wage one. You know, you don't have to be an economist to work out that, you know, all else equal, higher real wages that firms have to pay with unchanged productivity is probably a negative for the demand for labour. And, of course, that was the reasoning behind the OBR decision, that when the government announced that it was going to increase national insurance contributions, the employer national insurance contributions, which is an increase in the cost of employing labour, of course, that was going to be a negative for employment. We came up with an estimate of the size of that. What's been surprising, I think, since the minimum wage was introduced in the UK many, many years ago now, was how limited the impact seems to have been on employment of people at the lower end of the wage distribution. And I think I'm probably right in saying that relative to what many economists, labour economists' assessments of what might have happened, it doesn't seem to have been such a hit to employment. I'm not saying it's been positive, but it seems to be lower than people might have thought. There's another sort of side effect of minimum wage legislation, which is a potential positive for productivity, which is that one of the things people say about the UK is it's an economy that is very good on employment and has lower unemployment rates than many other countries, many European countries. but it has quite low real wages, and that encourages firms to employ people rather than capital, and it's one of the factors behind low investment and low productivity growth. So there's a potential offset as you bring up the wages of people at the lowest end of the wage distribution that may be a mild negative for employment, but is a positive as companies then think about more training, more capital investment, in a sense to substitute away from low productivity workers who get low wages.
And migration controls might have a similar impact.
And it's possible, and that's possible as well.
And are you going to touch on wealth taxes or leave that?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, not trying to dodge the questions, but the OBR's role really is to take whatever policies the government wants to implement and say, this is what we think the economic effects are. So we'll see where things go on wealth taxes.
And I'll touch on wealth taxes. There's no wealthy people left. They've all gone.
Yes, I mean, we had at our annual conference a couple of weeks ago, we had someone stand up with the sign saying abolish billionaires, and everyone's going, but we've abolished them. They're all
where are they?
the lady at the back, and then yes, that area there, the three.
Hi guys, Jamila Robertson, City AM columnist, former Conservative candidate as well. I went to a breakfast this morning and the speaker was speaking about welfare and the need for 2 million people on welfare to be in work by the end of this parliament. What do you think we can, obviously we're in opposition, but what do you think needs to be done by Rachel Reeves to create those 1.2 million jobs, because there are already 800,000 vacancies? What can be done to get people into the roles that already exist and also create 1.2 million more jobs when businesses are being squeezed? Do you think we need to make going from welfare into work slightly more compulsory and look at jobs of the future?
Thank you. And actually, we're slightly running out of time, so if we take three questions together and then... Yeah.
Hi, this one's for Mel, really, which is I'm slightly disturbed that your policy review is going to take 3 to 4 years. I do understand the detail, but I think it's imperative in the interim that you actually articulate a philosophy, an underlying vision and sense of direction as to where the party's actually going, because you're losing the debate by default. And I've no idea what the Conservative Party currently stands for, and I think there's some urgent work that needs to be done there, at least to keep the party in the fight, and to develop policies obviously in parallel with that underneath it. I think our leader she's a very capable technocrat, but I don't think she's the greatest communicator. And I think it's essential that the Conservative Party articulates a positive and optimistic vision for the future.
And then the lady in front.
Thank you. I have a question for David Miles. Sorry, I'm Irina from Bloomberg News. So Jumana Salehin, who's the chief European economist at Vanguard, told the Treasury Select Committee yesterday that the OBR should have used a sort of base case scenario on tariffs for the central forecast. So judging which of your 3 scenarios is the most likely, and then basing your central forecast on that, which is what sort of many private sector economists do. So what's your response to that? Is that something that you're considering? Thank you.
Well, I mean, David, do you want to ask that first, and then we go?
Well, just quickly on the tariff issue. I mean, it's very difficult. I don't want to repeat myself, but it's very difficult to work out what, on average, tariff policy of the US government will be over the next 5 years. As I say, I mean...
Next 5 minutes.
Well, quite. So we'll have an announcement today. It could have changed by Friday, and by Monday it could have changed back again. And so who knows where it's going. So it's very difficult to think of an objective, scientific, if you will, scenario that is your best guess as to what will happen. I mean, what would we have done? We could have said, oh, well, for the next 12 months there'll be a 20% tariff, and then it'll move down, and then you know.
Then Donald Trump will eat a bad slice of pizza, and it'll go up to 40% for.
Yeah, that would have been just like spurious. People would say, well, why on earth would you think that's the most likely outcome? And that's a good question. So what we preferred to do was say, let's show you a forecast if the effects of tariffs are essentially nothing, and show you some scenarios around that. And if people want to say, well, I think the most plausible scenario is the one where there's a 20% tariff on the UK. It lasts for 5 years. If you're that pessimistic, well, but there were some estimates as to what that did.
And Mel, but for everyone, the welcome into work question, but also then, why haven't you got any policies? Right.
Well, that's not true for a start. So the fact, though, that the question is asked and we have come out with policies rather underscores the fact that people are not listening to us, and there's a reason for that I think we have to be honest about and recognise and will take time to put right. And part of putting it right will be an effective opposition, holding the government to account and showing that we're going to be thoughtful and do the deep thinking to come up with the solutions. The policies that we come forward for example, on tax, as we've said, we'll reverse agricultural property relief, which should please farmers, business property relief that should please business people, VAT on private schools and so on. Those are hard policy positions taken very early in our period of opposition. We have also gone out and talked about net zero and the 2050 target. We've talked about indefinite leave to remain when it comes to migration. So we are out there saying things. It's difficult to get heard as an opposition, particularly in the position we're in at the moment, but nonetheless we are doing that. But we are yet to be cutting through to the degree that we need to. You could have asked that question in 1975. You could have asked that question when Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party and she set up a project called Stepping Stones, Milestones, with Keith
she set up
Joseph.
a policy called the Centre for Policy
Yes,
Studies.
she did.
Which then produced...
Correct, which produced that. But my point is the same, is that if you went back to 75, you would be sitting there saying exactly the same thing to whoever was representing her on the economy at the time. And she and Keith Joseph and John Hoskins and others and the CPS came together to come up with the answers that won us that 1979 election in the face of huge challenges, different challenges to some degree, but nonetheless similar in that sense. We can, however, of course, articulate vision and principles, and we are doing that. But my overriding rejoinder to you would be to be patient. This is a marathon, not a sprint. We are not going to have some kind of magic lever that in one bound Jack is free and all the problems have disappeared. It will take time, and there are times when leadership is about maintaining the course, having your eye on the horizon and doing the hard yards. There's no quick fix, okay? So on the question of welfare, just very quickly, I think a couple of observations. One is you need to do things where you've got a stock of 2.8 million people on long-term sickness and disability benefits, and you have a flow going onto that stock. You need to look at reforms around the way the work capability assessment works, so who's going onto that stock to receive those benefits. The flow, for example, of people who are citing mental health issues. It was expected that about 1% of those applying for that benefit back in the day would actually go through the gateway and onto that benefit. It ended up being about 17% by the time I brought in some reforms. So there was an explosion in that particular route, and there are lots of questions around why that's happening and how you tighten up the system to make sure that it's more realistic. You need to make sure you have incentives for people on that stock who are in the 2.8 million to try work without fear of losing the benefit if it doesn't work out. So you have to give kind of guarantees that they can work without that particular concern and all sorts of things to help them to do that. The final thing I would say is that if you look at the flow of people going on to those benefits, it can start very, very upstream. You want to get at it upstream. So occupational health in businesses, etc. People then, when they go to the doctor to get signed off with a fit note, 94% of the time they're signed off as being absolutely incapable of doing any work whatsoever, okay? I set up something called Work Well, whereby that person that goes through, instead of being signed off, goes to Work Well, they sit down, they look at the individual and say, right, the last thing you want to do is leave work. We'll work with your employer, you can get your desk moved from the top floor to the ground floor if you've got a broken hip, whatever it is that's going on, we'll keep you in that workforce. And then you provide support further on. So you have to attack the problem at every single stage along that journey. So you try and avoid somebody getting a long way from the labour market. Because once they're a long way from the labour market and they've been on those benefits for some time, the chances of them getting back into work diminishes very significantly. The final thing I'd say is the survey results show that of that roughly 3 million people sitting on those long-term sickness disability benefits with no requirements to look for work, 20% of them, 25% of them actually say that with sufficient support, they would actually like to get a job. So that tells me that probably half of that group could probably, with some effort and the right incentives and disincentives, be in employment. But once again, there is no absolute quick fix. It needs to be thought through. And that's why, to the gentleman who asked the first question, we need to take time to come up with those solutions if we're going to get it right for the country.
I think what I would just say to Mel is that you say it's difficult to get home, but businesses are desperate to hear from you. They're very frustrated with the Labour government. They want to be part of these policy conversations.
Yes.
They want to be at the table. I would say that I do think you have a bit of time, because when I speak to people, they're like, okay, it was about 2 years out from the last general election that Rachel Reeves was at every round table. She was all over the city. And that's what convinced them that Labour might be okay. So I just think businesses do want to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, last week I was in Wolverhampton with a whole bunch of very wealthy people, actually family businesses, very worried about BPR, talking about the issues. Yesterday I was with the CEO of NatWest Bank, and I was down on their trading floor looking at the kind of issues that they're facing. I am out there, my minister out there, but my overriding point is, it will take time to build this stuff up, and I know people are impatient, but bear with us.
Well, thank you so much to our panellists. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. I'm not sure how long they're hanging around for, but if you buttonhole, you try and grab them on the way out, they might be able to answer your questions. But thank you all so very much for joining us, and thank you to our panellists, Mel Stride, David Miles and Alys Denby.
Well done. Great. It was very